We've got the list printing out whatever happens to be in that object, but all that's in that object is the stuff we hard-coded in app. Let's make the form do a thing. Noteform.js. Here's the form. We could put an on submit there, but here's what I'm thinking. As soon as I start typing something, I want it to make the note and just keep it in sync all the time. So how can we do that? On change. So change is an event. If I put on change inside this input and set it to something, let's just set it to an arrow function for the moment. Changed. See what happens. Got my console open. Type. Changed. Type some more. Changed. Type some more. Changed 18 times. It's calling our function. Good. We want it to do a little more than that. What does it need to actually do? Let's put a named function in here. And this is a full-blown component, so we can just put another method in the class. I'll call it handle changes. Not handles changes, handle changes. I'll say console.log. Handling changes. And I'll change my on change from that to just handle changes. It is this dot handle changes. It's a method on this object, right? This dot handle changes. No parentheses, not the return value, the actual function. Does that work? Tap, tap. Handling changes. Yay. Cool. So, what's the target of that event, do you think? Louder, sorry. The input. It's not the form that changed. It's not the form we were listening for changes on. It's the actual input that has the on change. So, if we pass in the event and say event.target, we would expect the input, which means event.target.value should hopefully be what we typed. So what if we console log that? Yay. Heck, maybe we could call the exact same function on changes in the text area. On change equals this dot handle changes. Ba-ba-da-ba. It works. Neato. All right, so we can call a function when something changes. But what do we actually need to do with that data? We need to change that list of notes, right? Which is all the way up in app. So we're passing in some, or well, we're not yet. We could be passing stuff in with props, right? What if we pass the whole list down and try to change it? You can't change your props and expect them to have changed in the original place, right? That doesn't work. So if we need to change that stuff, since it lives in the state of app. There's only one component under the sun that can change that state. App, right? Callback. You remember that word? When is a function a callback? When do we use that word? When we pass a function as an argument to another function, we call it a callback. Passing functions as arguments, we do that all the time, right? We do it with map. We do it with add event listener. You can totally pass a function as an argument to another function. So guess how else you can pass a function around? What's kind of like arguments? Shh. Nothing personal. What's kind of like arguments? When we want to pass something from one thing to another, props. Holy smokes, you think we could pass a function in as a prop? Okay, so we said only the app component can change the app state. So let's go ahead and write that function, and then we'll worry about this functions as props wizardry. So up in the wonderful world of app, let's add a new method. I'm going to call it save note. And here's my dream. I want to pass in the note as an argument here. I kind of aim low. I'm not that ambitious. That's my greatest dream right now. And then the idea is I'll update this.state.notes to contain that one. So we'll have to use set state, right? This.setState. So we know we're going to call that at the end. But to change this.state.notes, I can't just change this.state.notes directly, right? Let's make a copy of it. Let's make a local variable called notes. And we won't just set it to this.state.notes because that wouldn't be a copy of it. That would be the original. So to make a copy of it, we'll use that spread syntax that we used yesterday. We used it on an array last time, right? Wouldn't it be cool if we could do this on an object? Dirty little secret. The spread syntax on arrays is actually part of ECMAScript. Spread syntax on an object isn't. We can do it because Babel supports it, and all of our JavaScript is already running through Babel to turn it into real JavaScript because we're using JSX, which isn't real JavaScript. So we can do this, but it isn't technically part of the standard and isn't supported directly in browsers. What we're writing here is not the code that gets sent to browsers anyway. Browsers don't understand JSX. So since we know we'll be using Babel, we can get away with using the spread syntax to copy objects. But I feel like it's necessary to tell you that that's not actually part of the ECMAScript standard. So just like we could take all the individual items out of an array, stick them in a new array, I can take all the properties out of an object, wrap them in an empty object, and there they are. So now I effectively have a copy of notes. And then I want to add this note to it. How do I do that? It's not an array. I can't use push or unshift. I need to do something like note dot some dang key or other equals note, right? What dang key? The keys are like note 1, note 2, etc. Suppose I passed in this note. How would I know what key to use? The ID, right? So what if I said notes square bracket note.id and just took the ID of whatever was passed in here? and use that as the key and set it equal to the note that I passed in. You dig? So then what do I set state to? I need to pass in an object, right? And then I can just say notes inside that object, which we know now is shorthand for this. Because if the name of the variable is the same as the key, ESX gives us this shorthand. Now I want to test this method to make sure that it generally works, assuming I pass in a good note before I go to the trouble of wiring up the form to it, because that part sounds complicated. Let's check out our dev tools. Did everybody install the React dev tools? So it may be at the very end of your tabs in your dev tools. If so, switch to it and then drag it up by the console or something, because we're going to use it a lot from here on out. This is going to be your friend when troubleshooting. When I first flip to the React tab in the dev tools, the app component is highlighted. And look what it has over here. Props and state. So I can actually see my state. Drill in and you can get to all the other components. But it's kind of hard to drill in and get to them. So look, there's a search bar right here. It might be up here in the upper right if your window's big enough. Say I want to get to note list. I'll just start typing list. Oh, look at that. I click on it, it highlights it on the page, and I see my props. Nice. So what I want to do right now is check out app. And I want to test save note. So remember the other day when we were looking at the normal inspector in elements? Click on an element and it said $0, and we could use that in the console. We did do that, right? Check out the React DevTools. I have the app component selected, $R. This is too good to be true. It can't be. $R. It's app. It's the component. So, like, could I say $R.state.notes? Yes, I can. So guess what else I can do? I could call $R.SaveNote and pass in a note. All right, so let's make a note. Let note equal, I'll call it my note. Just kicks. My note equals ID 64, the string 64, I guess. Title, Evans Waffle Kingdom. And then I'll call $R.SaveNote, pass in my note. Look at that. Oh, I forgot to put the S. But look at that. It's there. If I flip back to the React DevTools and I look at state over here, there it is at index 64. It works. Let's make another note. Let my other note equal, and let's leave the ID out. Let's just give it a title. Food, said the fat guy. That's me. That's all my variables have to do with food. Okay, let's call $R.SaveNote. Pass in my other note. Darn you, autocomplete. It's there. Let's look at our state. It saved it at index undefined. Not ideal, because I didn't set an ID. And what if I make another one that also doesn't have an ID? So hungry. Whoops. All right, that's there, but the other one isn't anymore. Why? Because it has the same darn key. Also, it looks like it might have given up trying to loop over these because that's undefined. I don't know. I don't know why it stopped. Point is, that's bad. We need these things to have IDs if that's how we're going to index them. So let's handle that case. In app.js inside save note, let's look for the situation where the ID is nothing. So let's say if not node ID. I don't care if it's null or undefined or just plain not there, which is undefined. If it's something falsy, I need to set it to something. So let's set note.id to, how about this? Make a template string, note dash. I really don't want to have to set another counter like max from Dinoplasty. How about this? Put a timestamp. I think the other day Seth did new date like this. Same thing, date.now is a little newer, but it does the same thing. So now by the time we get to line 35, or more importantly 36, we know the ID's there, right? Either it was already there or we set it on this line. So let's try that again. Okay, back to our hard-coded ones. App is still selected in my dev tool, so I can still use $R to get to it. Let note equal something without an ID. Oh, title, something without an ID. $R, save note, pass in note there. Something without an ID. And if we look in the dev tools at the state, there it is. So that's a very long ID, the number of seconds since January 1st, 1970. I like it. Now, that does mean potentially if we added 2 in the same second, they could have the same ID. We're not going to worry about that right this second. That's good enough for our purposes. Cool. So now they'll always have an ID, so they'll always get saved at the right spot on the notes array. So, what about when the form is actually submitted? We're still not doing that. So we've got this nice method save note here on my app component, but I need access to that from note form. What am I going to do? That's right. I'm going to cry. Until Mateen saves me. What do you think? He's not? Don't let me drown in my own tears, man. I have save note on app component. I really want to be able to call this from a different component. If I have something on one component and I want it in another, what do I use? Props. That's right. Thank you for saving me. So in app, I'll pass it down to main first, right? And I could give it any name I wanted here, but I'm sane, so I'm going to make it save note. I'm going to set it equal to what? This dot save note, right? So in main, That's one of my props now, props.saveNote. So I'm passing props.notes to note list. But it's note form that this needs to go to, right? So I can say save note equals props.saveNote. Does it make sense why that works? It's just another prop. It's just like passing a function as an argument. By adding another prop called saveNote here, passing it to main, all of these props together are going to get passed as that one argument props. I can get them back out like this. Or I could have destructured them, right, and done something like this. Right, could have done that. I won't this time. Just so we have one place where we're still doing it that way. And now in note form, we should have access to that. Now this time around, it's an actual class that extends React component. So how do I get to my props from inside a class component? This dot props, right? And then I need to call that from here somehow. So how about I say this.props.saveNote. And I know I need to pass in a note, so I'll just hardcode one for the moment. Title created from note form component. Explode! Cannot read property props of undefined. Oh, I'm sorry. I read that. I shouldn't do that, right? I should see an error message and immediately start trying to troubleshoot? No. Read your error message. It'll help you. Cannot read property props of undefined. It shows me which line. Line 7 here of note form. This.props.saveNote. Property props of undefined? I'm calling props of this, not of undefined. Oh, this is undefined, it's telling me. You see that that's what it's saying? It's trying to access property props of undefined. Well, it's this.props I'm calling, so this must be undefined. Why? Event handler didn't bind. So far we've looked at a couple different ways to do this, both of which use bind, right? So we could do it down here. But if we do that, we need to do it two different places. To keep from having to do it two different places, we could do it in the constructor. And then every time we try to call handle changes, it'll be the bound version. So we could add a constructor here. And if we add a constructor, we have to call the constructor from the superclass. There's a little something else missing there, though. What's missing in my constructor? Not yet. But I'll go ahead and do this. What did I say? This.handle changes. I want that to be this.handle changes. .bind this. So what I'm doing here. This.handle changes .bind this returns a function. Bind actually returns a function that is a bound version of the original function. And by assigning that back to this.handle changes is no longer the original function. It's the bound version of that function. I'm replacing it. That way, every time I refer to it, I know what the binding of this will be, even if it's an event handler. But I'm missing something here. Let's see what happens here. Still says cannot read property props undefined. I refresh, it's okay. Start typing. I've still got problems. What's wrong? I'm passing props into note form, right? Ordinarily, you can get to those with this dot props if it's a class. But something had to go to the trouble of assigning this dot props equal to that. That happens inside the constructor in React component, which means as long as we don't write our own constructor, it just takes care of it for us. So in a stateless functional component, it's very obvious that the props get passed in as an argument. But they do here too, as an argument to the constructor. So if we write our own constructor, we have to remember to grab the props out of there and pass it up to the constructor from the superclass. So if you have a class, how do you instantiate an object from that class? I would say something like new note form, like that. If you have an argument you want to pass in, you put it in here, right? So somewhere along the line, that's what's happening. It's still basically passing the props in as an argument. It's just an argument to the constructor because this is a class. And the fact that it's available as this dot props is because somewhere within the bowels of React, it's doing that for us. And that happens in the constructor, so when we write our own constructor, remember to pass those props along. Now what happens? It's still exploding. This.state.notes, currently property notes of undefined on line 35 of app.js. Line 35 of app.js. This.state here. Now this one's undefined. What the heck's that? Well, once we pass it down as a prop, and called it from somewhere else. Do you remember the rule for how this is bound on an object? I mean, on a method? This will be bound to whatever object you called the method from. And we didn't call it from the app component. We call it from this dot props here. So inside save note, doesn't matter that we declared it over here. What matters is how we called it. So it's not going to be the right thing when we call save note. I freaking swear. All right. Let's look at some other ways that we can bind this. So we did it at the place where we actually assigned the event listener in this case. We also did it up in the constructor, which is how we're doing it right now for handle changes. Let me ask you this. Back when we had an arrow function in here, doing a console log, what was this? What if we console log this? What's this going to be? Ordinarily, in an event handler, well, in React, it's undefined. Let's see. It's note form. It's the component. Why? Because arrow function. Arrow functions bind this the way we expect most of the time. That's their secret. It's like calling dot bind this at the end every time you make an arrow function. We've seen that in practice a couple times, like when we were using map and stuff. You could do it on an event listener too, on an event handler. So inside an arrow function, this is going to be the right thing. So what if we set onChange equal to an arrow function that then calls this dot handle changes manually? Just comment all this out and put a console log this. And just to be sure we're looking in the right place, I'll put a console log handle changes here. That does it. Because now, handle changes isn't directly the event handler, is it? This arrow function is the event handler. And then that happens to be calling handle changes, but it's calling handle changes as a method now, using a dot. Which means that inside the method, this will be set to whatever object we called it from. Whatever object we called the method from. So that's another way we could do it. Use arrow functions. So what if we could just make handle changes an arrow function? What? It's a method of this object, right? It would be cool if you could just set the properties of an object by doing something like this. I mean, that'd be really nice. Guess what? You can now, sort of. So this is called a property initializer. When you just set your properties this way on a class. And that is right now a proposal for ECMAScript, but it has reached the stage where they've said this is definitely going to be in a future version. It's not there yet, but it's definitely going to be in a future version of ECMAScript. It is subject to some change because it's only a stage 2 proposal. But by golly, it'll be there someday. And guess what? We're not relying on the browser to implement this. We're running everything through Babel. Right? We're just turning it into JavaScript that the browsers actually understand. And guess what's supported in Babel today? Heck yeah, property initializers. So what good does that do us? Well, here's a little secret. We're not going to use it right now. But we could actually set state outside of the constructor just by using a property initializer. Also, we could declare our methods like this. Handle changes equals this arrow function. Since arrow functions bind this automatically, now this dot handle changes is this arrow function. And if we set an arrow function as the change handler, well, then this is what we expect. Come on, this can't, come on. I'm full of crap, right? Let's see. Tappity tappity. It's note form. So why this works is a little complicated. But basically, we're just setting this property of the object to an arrow function, which binds this the way we want. So if we get in the habit of writing our methods this way in classes, we don't have to ever say dot bind again. So I'm going to do it. The other ways are probably a little more common in existing code, but I think pretty soon this is going to be a lot more popular because it's the way of the future and it's a lot easier than the others, frankly. All you have to do is remember to write it this way instead of this way, and it just takes care of it. All right, so what problem were we actually trying to solve here? Yeah, our constructor isn't really doing anything right now. We can come back to that. When we typed in here, we got an error, right? That this isn't what we expected inside save note on app component. So we could fix this by down here where we pass it in, binding it to this. Or we could just define it as an arrow function using a property initializer. And it's just going to do the right thing. Let's see. So what are we expecting to happen? All right, so it's passing in a hard-coded note with the title created from note form component. Here we go. Created from note form component. Created from note form. Created from note form. Every time on change, it's creating a new. Every time I add another letter, it's creating a new note. This is probably not the final answer here, but by golly, I'm not getting an error anymore. Let's refresh the page and get rid of those. I just type one letter. There we go. Created from note form component. Type another letter. Another one. See, every time on change, it's calling save note again with a new thing. So they're talking to each other now. It's just kind of doing something silly. Instead, we want it to pass in what was actually in the form, right? So even if I get the values from the form and pass it in using an object literal here, it's going to be a new object every time. So we need it to keep changing the same object, which means we're actually going to have to add state to note form. So bummer, we have 2 components with state now instead of 1. But we know how to do that. Add a constructor. Remember, this has props, so we have to do it this way. Then we can set this.state. And what do we need in state? We just need the one note, right? The one note that's in the form. So note, colon, some object with like an empty ID and title and body. So here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to extract that blank note into its own method because I have a feeling I'm going to be using it more than once. And because it's just it kind of becomes self-documenting code if I do this. Check it out. So let's make another method called blank note. And I'll use our new pattern of a property initializer, even though I'm not actually going to use this inside here. It's just going to be my habit now. And all this is going to do is return that blank note with an ID of null, a title of empty string, and a body of empty string. And then up here, I'm going to say this.state.note is this.blank note parens, the return value of this.note, of this.blank note. Now, why am I doing that instead of just putting this object right there? Well, if I just put the object in there, that's kind of a magic value. Anytime you use a literal like that, and I have to read it to figure out why am I doing that here? What is this note I'm hard coding? If I look at it, then I can see, okay, it's blank, I guess. But now I see, oh, okay, I set the note to a blank note. Because every time you create a new method or a variable, it gives you an opportunity to name that thing. And names are really handy. They're as good as comments. Better, arguably. So blank note. I know exactly what this function does. If I had called it some awful function name because I'm lazy, then I wouldn't know what it does. Take the time to carefully consider the names of your methods and your variables. Do yourself a favor. So now it's very obvious what this method does, and it's very obvious what I'm setting the initial state to. Plus, I can reuse it. But sometimes, even if you're never going to reuse something, extracting it to its own method can be helpful. All right, so what of it? What am I going to do now inside handle changes? Well, I want to get that note out of state. Right, this.state.note. And I want to change it. So I suppose we should make a copy of it. We don't want to change state directly, right? So const note equals, use the spread syntax, a copy of this.state.note. And how do I know which field I changed? Because they both call the same function, right? Well, thankfully, I gave them both a name. This one has a name of title. This one has a name of body. And we already established that the event target is going to be whichever field changed, right? So what would event.target.name be? Title, body. The point being, if I want to change this .note.title, I've made my copy here. I can say note, square bracket, event.target.name. And set it to event.target.value. And now we've changed just the property that actually changed on the form. Then I should probably set state, right? This.setState note. It's just like writing note colon note. And I said a while back that this should be a controlled component. Do you remember that from Seth's talk? I want React to be in charge of setting the value of this input. So I'm actually going to say value equals this.state.note.title. And down here, value equals this.state.note.body. And then anytime the state is changed, it's going to update this. So I know I'm keeping those in sync. So then what do I actually want to pass to this .props.saveNote? That's app.saveNote, right? Which expects the note to be passed in as an argument. So what do I put here? I call saveNote and pass what? The dang note, right? So what is that? Wake up. What do you think? I went to all this trouble to get the changes out of the form and update this note. But now I need to pass it up to save note. Or I've just been wasting my time. I need to add it to the list. What do I put in there? Louder. This.state.note. Now, what's the risk here? This isn't quite going to work. Say again? Well, now we've got state of our own here. Yeah. So this.state.note is right. But there's another problem. What do we know about set state and how it works? What did Seth tell us about that? Tom? It's asynchronous. So here's what that means. When I say this.setState, JavaScript goes, okay, I'll just be over here setting state, but it might take a while, so you go ahead and do your thing. And it's just going to go ahead and run the next line, potentially before this is finished. So the state might not be updated yet. That's what we mean when we say asynchronous. It's going to go do something in the background, and it's going to let us go on our merry way and just keep executing more stuff. So to make sure that this gets run after setState actually finishes, setState lets us pass in a callback. So we can pass in a second argument. That's a function. So let's just put a little arrow function here. And all that arrow function is going to do is call this.props.saveNote. To make that a little easier to read. So you see what's happening here? I need to set state, so first I pass in what I want to change in state. Then I pass in a function that I want to run afterward, only after that's finished. Now why did I pass in an arrow function instead of just passing in this.props.saveNote? Because it expects a function, and this isn't a function. This is the return value of saveNote, right? I need to pass in a function, or it would tell me such and such is not a function. It would probably tell me undefined is not a function because saveNote doesn't return anything. See what's happening? I'm waiting until state has finished to do this. Does it work? No errors. That's a start. Oh, sorry. Please. Ha-ha! And look at this. I'm going to make some changes. Please, please. Oh, yeah. Please, please me. Oh, yeah. That's a Beatles song. Just start typing a body. Oh, it works too. Look at that. And it's the same note. It's not creating a new one every time I type a letter. Nice. We did it. Yay. That was only the most excruciating thing we've ever done in our lives. Let's celebrate by committing. Save a note from the form. Make sure I don't have any silly console logs in there anymore. I don't think I do. No. So what did we learn? We wrote a function up here in app. We passed it as a prop all the way down through main. Passed it as a prop from there to note form. And we called it from there so that we could actually change the state of app. Because the note list lives all the way up at app. And so app component is the only one that can change it. Only a component can change its own state. We did all the things we needed to do to handle the changes from these inputs. We learned we can copy objects with the spread syntax just like we can copy arrays, although we learned that that's actually not an ECMAScript feature, but a Babel feature. We did this crazy thing. We used a property initializer to add a method. That way we could just set it to an arrow function, which binds this the way we wanted it to be, no matter how we call it. We could pass it as a prop to another thing, and this will still be set to the component where this method actually lives. Good stuff.